Hi there, everyone. So, the crunch is really on at this point for many of us, isn't it? It's like we're being squeezed and forced to let go of whatever is not working for us, whether we feel ready to do this or not. Ascension is just really pushing us up to a higher frequency now, and it can sometimes be quite painful, both emotionally and for some of us physically. If we're still clinging to old patterns and beliefs and emotional reactions, or to old relationships or old conditions that are holding us back in our awakening process, this push to let them go can get unbelievably harsh at times. And yet, this is what's happening if we can't see clearly what's not really working for us anymore and are not able to simply let it go. Circumstances arise to make it obvious that these old patterns and unresolved issues in us and things in our life have to leave. You could say it's a type of death process we're involved in, a death of our old 3D identity. But it's also a birth process that's occurring simultaneously, a birth into a much higher frequency 5D self that is tremendously more powerful and free and peaceful. Unfortunately, it's often simply not obvious or knowable that this death and birth process is what's occurring at the time when something awful happens. It can feel as if disaster has occurred and that we're being brutally shaken in some way. And so overwhelm can happen, leaving us wondering for a time if we can even continue on. But then somehow we find that we can. Somehow courage and strength arise within us and we do carry on, often not knowing where we're going or how we're going to continue to survive within the new circumstance we find ourselves in now. But we just take the next step in front of us anyway, right? In essence, we somehow shift into a type of warrior we never knew we could become. We find the wherewithal needed to just continue on wherever our path is taking us. Now, maybe you began experiencing some of this challenge and turmoil beginning a few years back when, on top of everything else you were already probably experiencing on your ascension path, the whole COVID madness just hit the planet. And with all that brought with it, you maybe began experiencing divisions with family members and friends over decisions of how to respond to the vaccines being offered and the mandates being forced on you. And heartbreaking arguments and separations may have occurred, with loved ones, causing despair and hopelessness back at that point. And maybe this is still going on for you in some way, maybe due to yet other things that are occurring in the world. And yet you find you are surviving all this too. In a certain way, individual ascension is a microcosm of the ascension occurring on the planet as a whole. Just as the old world is dying, we see this, it's all happening out there. We're witnessing the death of an old sense of our personal self, also. One that maybe didn't work all that well in a number of ways, but at least it was generally comfortable living in it, right? Because it was known and it was familiar. We'd grown used to figuring things out in order to live in certain ways that kind of worked, even though we were not especially thriving, maybe. We got used to sacrificing certain important things to us when necessary, to feeling powerless about certain circumstances, and never being able to find success in certain endeavors. We just kind of assumed that life was like this. We accepted that we all had limitations, and the mediocre success and happiness we could achieve, at least some of the time, just had to be enough. Well, the new high-frequency energies on the planet are no longer allowing us to carry on with this limited, low-frequency understanding about ourselves. It's too small, too limited, too powerless for who we truly are. Our identification with this old self needs to die. It's a big part of the ascension process. And this death is occurring now in rapid motion. And these energies are compelling us to trust our ascension process in a way we've never had to before. And sometimes radical changes need to happen. Sometimes things that are really important to us are just pulled away from us, seemingly by external forces. But what's really happening is it's our deeper self that is doing this. We need to trust that if something is disappearing from our lives, it's because we can't ascend with it anymore. We need to trust that we are being guided in the best direction we can go and to get where we're headed, into a whole new world and life that operate in a radically new way. And in order to live comfortably in this new life, we need to shift as quickly as possible out of our familiar 3D consciousness and our acceptance of 3D circumstances and move into 5D consciousness and a realization of how life might work while living in 5D reality. As I've discussed in other YouTubes recently, fully embodying 5D consciousness involves more than simply learning how to respond in more positive ways to challenges in life and strengthening your spiritual awareness. It involves more than just focusing on love and light as much as possible. Now, this is very important to begin with, for sure. And it also includes being aware of the controlled and manipulation condition of humankind that has existed for thousands of years and breaking free of this condition. But in the end, shifting into 5D consciousness involves even more than all of this. It requires an actual shift in your entire sense of identity to a full and embodied knowing of the eternal essence that you are, beyond your personal self and the story of your life. It entails a shift from believing your body, your emotions, and your mind, or even what you've come to believe is your spiritual self. It's a radical transformation of your whole sense of yourself, experienced continuously in your everyday life. It includes a complex process of dismantling of much of what you've come to believe you are as a person, as a being, even as a being who's on a spiritual path. And all this, of course, is a tall order to accomplish, especially during these times of great disruption and chaos in the world. In fact, what can be especially difficult in this process is if you're learning that on top of everything else, the spiritual practices and teachings that have served you for many years no longer seem to give you the kind of support and solace you need. You might find you're now questioning at least some of your spiritual beliefs. They don't seem relevant or even accurate anymore. You may even feel a sense of loss about what you believed your spiritual mission in life to be. Maybe it no longer feels important or workable to you. If any of this is occurring, you can realize that the spiritual practices and beliefs you've had likely came into being during the times of what is known as the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and suffering. The eons of time that humanity has lived in the low frequency of what you can also call the third dimension. They were designed for assisting people through this long age of ignorance and separation from source. And since we're now moving into a whole new age of light, what's known as the Sat Yuga, or the fifth dimension, spiritual practices and beliefs naturally need to change. But making this shift in your life and abandoning old beliefs and understandings may initially be really challenging for you. And in addition, as if the ascension process weren't confusing enough already, what you're likely also experiencing is what could be called descension. On the one hand, you are ascending in your consciousness into a higher frequency, which, due to the unknown territory you're now passing through, can feel confusing and even frightening at times. You're having to learn who you now are and what works in this new higher vibrational landscape and what doesn't. And yet at the same time, 5D frequencies are also now descending into your body, clearing space for your higher multidimensional self to anchor itself more and more securely into your body. These higher frequencies are causing numerous uncomfortable and even temporarily painful physical and emotional changes. And in the process, as these lower energies are being forcibly released, old traumas to the body and unresolved emotional patterns tend to get activated again. And in addition, long dormant DNA is also reactivating. Your brain is being rewired. And all systems in your body are attempting to adjust to all of this. So along with old weaknesses in the body reappearing, new physical ailments may also be showing up, seemingly out of nowhere. It's a lot for a body to take, especially one that is also dealing with aging at this point. So just take this in for a moment. No wonder you can feel overwhelmed and lost at times. It can feel as if your old familiar consciousness is fading very quickly, and yet your 5D consciousness has not yet totally shown up and established itself. You're still in the process of letting go of all the old identifications and the psychological debris of your older self. And you're only somewhat aware of the newer energies of your 5D self at this point. You're in what I've called the Ascension void. There's a sensation of emptiness in this state, as well as confusion and chaos at times, and as well as feeling, alone and vulnerable. But then, to add even further to the confusion you may be experiencing, another puzzling phenomenon can also occur. Even when you're having some of the worst days of your life, you may find that suddenly you're experiencing days, even weeks, in which all seems to be proceeding along very smoothly. You're feeling calm, even happy and unaffected by all that's happening out in the world. Your life, although maybe altered and restricted in certain ways, seems to be filled with a simple sense of contentment and even excitement at times. You feel free, just floating along peacefully and even joyfully enjoying your life. And you may think, oh great, I guess I've finally shifted into a higher frequency. Now life is going to be okay again and even better. This is also something that can happen due to the high frequency energies of light that are now flooding the earth. It's possible to tune into them and shift for periods of time into what feels like 5D consciousness. And you may think you're finally past the worst of it and that you're out the other side of all the challenging stuff you've been dealing with. However, if you're like most people, these periods do tend to eventually come to an end, and difficulties return, along with the shift back into a lower vibration. Might not be quite so bad, but it's still kind of there. And this is because If you're not yet fully established in the higher frequency of 5D, there is the tendency to eventually slip back into 4D and even 3D consciousness for a while again. It can all be very confusing and unsettling. However, perhaps the most basic challenge that can occur during these times of ascension is that of somehow losing your old familiar sense of identity. With so much change and loss, your very sense of who you are may seem eerily unfamiliar to you at times. Certain parts of yourself may feel like they've been disabled and are nowhere to be found anymore, except maybe in your quickly fading memory, because maybe you're also having memory problems on top of everything. And pursuits and passions that used to be exciting to you have now perhaps become dull and uninteresting. Your life as a whole may have become something almost alien to you. And you may be experiencing waves of grief for things, that are lost, that just kind of pass through you. If any of this has been happening for you, like I'm saying, it's important to understand that what's occurring can be seen as the process of death of an old version of yourself. In the past, this type of experience might have been called a dark night of the soul, right? But this is actually different. It's not just a dark period of spiritual doubt happening. It's a radical shift of your core sense of identity that's occurring. It's an experience of spiritual awakening intense enough to cause a great deal of fear and doubt about everything you've believed in or thought you were. And yet, if you're experiencing any of these things I've described here, it means you are totally on track on your path into the fifth dimension. It's an indication that you are deep into your process of ascension and you are awakening very rapidly. This type of both inner and outer chaos is just what occurs when you're passing through the higher fourth dimension, a space where great transformation is taking place very rapidly, in which both death and birth are occurring simultaneously. But you can know that whatever is happening is exactly what needs to happen for a while. All your old unhealthy 3D habits, thoughts, emotions, fears, and ways of operating need to be left behind. You're experiencing a rebirth into a whole new identity, preparing to live in a whole new dimension of reality. It's all very confusing because this process is so multifaceted and complex. So you really need to understand this and be compassionate with yourself when you go through these things. But there's also a real benefit you can become aware of feeling lost and confused during this transitional period. And that is that it inevitably leads you to a deeper inquiry into who you actually are and who you're not. If you've come to this point of feeling a loss of identity, you now have the opportunity for deeper spiritual investigation as to who you are at the very core of your being. But it's an interesting thing to watch because in initially feeling a loss of familiar identity, your first response may be a strenuous and seemingly urgent attempt to create a new identity. You may decide to change external elements in your life, like your work or your home or your friends or your social life. Or maybe you take on new higher frequency goals. Maybe you commit to creating new emotional responses to life or new mental habits and beliefs through healing programs or new spiritual practices. Or perhaps you create a new story about who you now are, trying to give your life some meaning. Or you might also seek out good astrologers or channels or psychics who can see things about you that you can't. Or you begin reading books that describe characteristics of people based on metaphysical principles, all in an attempt to figure out who you now are on a deeper spiritual level. And perhaps you've enrolled in classes so you can become a healer or rediscover intuitive abilities that are latent within you. Doing these kind of things can certainly be helpful. They can assist you in sloughing off old habits and bring new energies into your life. They can keep your mind focused positively and help you feel like you're moving ahead and that you've entered, into a higher energy field. In fact, doing some of these things, despite all that's happening in the world, you may be having increasingly deeper experiences of living in a much higher consciousness in which you feel more joy and love than ever before. You may feel as if you're finally creating a life that you've always wanted. And all of this is great. But then, you may also find that something unexpected happens and you find yourself kind of back in your old familiar 3D self again. Unhappy or impatient or in pain and dissatisfied with your life. And you may finally realize that none of your efforts to ascend yourself are enough. You're still dealing with issues in your life. Old stuff keeps coming up for resolution. Relationships continue to be somewhat bumpy, and at times you're still subject to deep emotional suffering. No matter how hard you strive to change yourself and your life, many of the same emotional and mental challenges continue to arise. It can be so confusing and extremely frustrating. And of course, if you're aware of the dark forces that have existed on the planet, as I've described in other YouTubes and books, you understand the main reason that all these efforts you've made have met with so little change is that your path to higher consciousness has been greatly impeded. So you probably feel even more discouraged. And yet, even with all that going on, what you can discover is that your inability to truly change into a higher expression of yourself is also due to the fact that you are still unknowingly identifying with your 3D self, your body-mind self, your ego personality self, whatever you want to call it. And this self is doing what it's always done, attempting to define itself with new and important things that you're doing and you're feeling, and with new beliefs and decisions you've made. It's trying to create a new self, a better self, that could hopefully become your 5D self. If you've tried any of this, you may have realized that all you've really been doing is rearranging the furniture of your 3D self. You've attempted to somehow reinvent yourself. But the truth is, you cannot create your 5D self. You can only discover it. It's already there within you. It's always been there. It's just not been fully recognized. What's needed is a complete shift out of identifying with this 3D body-mind version of yourself and into discovering something much deeper within you that has next to nothing to do with what you do, feel, or think. It lives in an alternate reality, one that you've likely yearned for your entire life. Your 5D self is so different from your 3D self. It is so magnificent so much larger, so much more powerful than you've been imagining yourself to be, that it's difficult to imagine it. And yet, it is so close, so familiar to you. You may have never really recognized it, even when it's come into your awareness. Now, I've discussed the nature of this ethereal self that is your true nature in my YouTubes called What Exactly is 5D, especially in the Part 2 video. And if you haven't heard them yet, I encourage you to, because I believe you will recognize what I describe and realize that you are already having experiences of this 5D self. You just need to recognize them. It can be very confirming and validating. And it can make it easier to find your way through the confusion of this fourth dimensional passage we're now traveling through, if you can know what to become aware of. But meanwhile, you just have to do your best to trust the confusing and challenging process of ascension that's now occurring. As difficult as it may seem, you can keep in mind that along with the death process you're going through, you are also experiencing an exciting birth process, a birth into your true multidimensional identity that has actually been here all along. It just hasn't been obvious. And in certain ways has not really been accessible till now. And another important key to making it through these times, especially if you fall into overwhelm, is to stay in the present moment as much as you can and determine what absolutely needs to be handled or addressed in that moment. Sometimes you do need to act and to make decisions very quickly, seemingly without enough time to think things through. And at those times, you just need to do your best and trust you're being guided, because you are. But other times, you can find that there's actually nothing you need to do for the time being. All is really okay. There's no need to go into the future or make any plans of what you may need to handle. And you can relax for a while. If you can stay out of thinking about the possible future where disaster or overwhelm may occur, you really are avoiding unnecessary suffering for yourself. Again, you need to trust the process, because you are being guided very carefully at this point by your higher self and by your guides, whether you're aware of it or not. And you can also note something very important, that in handling all the stress and pain and fear you may currently be experiencing, you are becoming stronger within yourself. You're becoming wiser. Every time you pick yourself up again and keep going, you have tapped into a deeper part of yourself that is powerful and determined to survive and thrive, no matter what may come your way. And you have grounded yourself further into your 5D self-identity. And in my next YouTube, I will be describing this 5D self in more detail and discussing how to help bring on more experiences with it, and how to prolong these experiences when they do occur. So until then, I again send you my love and many, many blessings.